Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. This is the subject, among many, but a principal subject that caused me to be interested in serving on this committee. So I'm glad that this hearing is taking place. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here. As I'm sure some of my colleagues have heard me say, I come from the city of Flint, Michigan. There's a lot folks know about Flint, but a little history lesson I think is important. Flint rose to prominence in the late 1930s when the workers in my community, members of the UAW, sat down in the factories for 44 days, and on February 11, 1937, secured the first UAW contract, which engaged the company and ensured fair wages, decent working conditions, and is a turning point in many ways in creating the American middle class. In fact, at one point in time in the early 1970s, Flint had the highest per capita income in the United States. It's hard to juxtapose that with the conditions that we experience right now. Partly driven by liberalizing of U.S. import market, I mean specifically regarding China, depressed labor standards. So all of the progress that was made by the fact that the workers were able to secure those basic rights in many ways was diminished because the failed trade policies that this country implemented, including, sadly, NAFTA. NAFTA promised changes to Mexico's labor laws that would allow American workers to compete fairly, but also would allow, importantly, Mexican workers to work for a higher standard of living, and we want that. But we, of course, now know that those promises for labor reform in Mexico that were promised in NAFTA failed. The average worker in Mexico today makes around $2 an hour. So weak labor laws that have suppressed wages there have affected our economy here. In my hometown, which once had 90,000 auto manufacturing jobs, today has about 10,000 or so, largely affected by those changes by NAFTA. So with this new agreement, NAFTA 2.0, or as some call the USMCA, we're hearing some of those same promises. And for somebody from my hometown, it rings quite familiar to hear these promises of labor reforms that are going to ensure that our workers will not be in a position of having to compete with very low wages. We're hearing that under this new agreement, Mexican workers are going to be able to assemble and form free and independent labor unions. Of course, we want that. But I have to say, coming from where I come from, we're skeptical for good reason. So I guess maybe, Mr. Nasser, if you wouldn't mind commenting, number one, on what we know about the proposed agreement or the proposed legislation, whether it's adequate. Secondly, what do we do if Mexico fails to live up to even the agreement that we would sign? If you could just comment, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I think a few things. First of all, I think people need to understand how bad it is in Mexico, as you were talking about. I mean, there are plants that open. There's a BMW plant, for example, that opened, and the workers there were signed to a contract that they never saw. The plant wasn't even operating yet because you have these company unions that dominate in Mexico. That is why wages are so low. They're closely associated with the government. Is this really going to break it up? Is it going to break up that system? I can't tell you that it will. And that is why we need to see action first, and not just promises, but actual action here. And I want to refer to what Congressman Pasquero was saying. A lot of the pressure to keep the Mexican laws so weak comes from U.S. corporations. And it's not a matter of fact that all U.S. companies have done poorly by NAFTA. Many have done quite well. It's workers in all three countries that have done poorly. That's a fact. And one last thing, we're not against trade. We agree with actually much that's been said about the importance of port jobs, and we don't disagree with that. We just want the trade to be fair and one that raises wages in all countries instead of lowering them.
Thank you. And I just want to make a final point, and it goes to your testimony, Mr. Nasser. All of this, for all of us, at least certainly for myself, is about how we support American workers. And that's the only measure, to me, that's going to count when evaluating any of this. So I appreciate your testimony, appreciate the testimony of all the witnesses, and I yield back.